War is loud, brutal, and unforgiving. It does not ask who a man was before it found him, nor does it care what remains when it is finished. It takes everything, strength, fear, faith, and doubt, and forges them into something harder and colder. I was shaped by war, molded by its violence, and ultimately became its voice. By 1943, in the burning fields and shattered towns of Sicily, I was known as unstoppable. My name carried weight across the battlefield. My army advanced with speed and ruthless efficiency, crushing resistance and forcing victory wherever we marched. To the public and to history, I was a hero. To my soldiers, I was something else entirely, an iron figure of discipline, fear, and relentless demand. Discipline was my religion. I believed it separated victory from defeat, order from chaos, civilization from collapse. I preached that suffering was not merely unavoidable but necessary. Pain, I insisted, was proof of worth. A soldier who endured hardship without complaint was a soldier worthy of respect. Weakness, on the other hand, was a contagion, one that could destroy an army from within if left unchecked. These beliefs were not born in Sicily. They had been forged over decades of service, through earlier wars and endless training, through the study of ancient commanders and modern battles alike. I had learned that hesitation cost lives and mercy invited failure. Or so I believed. The men under my command followed me because I demanded everything from them. I asked them to march when they were exhausted, to fight when they were afraid, and to advance when every instinct told them to stay low and survive. They feared me, yes, but fear can be a powerful motivator. In battle, it sharpens focus and suppresses doubt. I used it deliberately, convinced that an army driven by fear of its commander would never break before the enemy. History seemed to reward this belief. Victories came swiftly, the enemy retreated. The newspapers praised my leadership, my tactics, my unyielding will. Each success reinforced the legend, and the legend began to consume the man. Yet beneath the medals, speeches, and carefully maintained image of confidence, something within me was restless. Victory did not bring peace. Instead, it left an uncomfortable silence. When the guns fell quiet and the orders slowed, I felt unease creeping into my thoughts. Peace had no place for men like me. I had built my identity on movement, conflict, and command. Stillness felt unnatural, even dangerous. I thrived in chaos, not calm. Without the constant pressure of battle, doubts I had long suppressed began to surface. As my army waited for new orders in Sicily, I found myself unable to rest. I paced my quarters at night, replaying battles in my mind, searching for flaws, imagining future engagements. During the day, I began visiting hospitals and aid stations. Officially, I told myself it was duty. A commander should see the cost of war, should remind the wounded that their sacrifices were recognized. But in truth, my visits were driven by something deeper and more personal. I was searching for reassurance, proof that I was still human beneath the legend that had grown around me. The hospitals were places of quiet suffering, far removed from the noise and glory of the battlefield. Inside the canvas tents, there were no sweeping maneuvers or heroic charges, only broken bodies and exhausted minds. Men lay still, staring at ceilings, their faces pale and hollow. Some bore obvious wounds, bandages soaked through with blood, limbs missing, skin burned and scarred. Others carried injuries that could not be seen. Their eyes were distant, their hands trembling, their voices unsteady. These men had faced the same battles as their comrades, yet they had been undone in different ways. As I walked among them, I spoke words of encouragement, but they felt rehearsed and hollow. I told them they had done their duty, that they were brave, that the army was proud of them. Some smiled weakly. Others avoided my gaze. In their eyes, I sometimes caught a reflection of myself, tired, uncertain, and fraying at the edges. It disturbed me more than I cared to admit. I had spent my career demanding strength from others, yet I had never truly examined what strength meant. I told myself that fear was the enemy. That belief had guided every decision I made. Fear, I argued, caused hesitation. Hesitation led to failure. Failure led to death. Therefore, fear had to be crushed wherever it appeared. But standing in those hospitals, surrounded by men who had already given everything they had, I felt a crack form in that logic. These soldiers were not cowards. They had endured bombardment, watched friends die, and survived horrors that words could barely describe. If they were afraid now, was that weakness? Or was it simply humanity asserting itself after being pushed too far? I did not yet have the courage to answer that question. Instead, I clung tighter to my beliefs. The legend of the unstoppable general demanded certainty, not doubt. To question myself felt like betrayal, not just of my role, but of the image the army and the nation had placed upon me. And so I continued forward, unaware that the line between discipline and cruelty was already beginning to blur. Looking back, I understand that those hospital visits marked the beginning of my reckoning. They were the first moments when the armor I had built around myself began to crack. War had given me purpose, authority, and fame, but it had also taken something essential from me: the ability to see men as anything other than instruments of victory. I was still searching for reassurance, for proof of my own humanity, even as my actions would soon prove how far I had drifted from it. War had made me powerful, but it had also made me blind. And in that blindness, I was already moving toward a moment that would force me to confront not the enemy abroad, but the truth within myself. In a field hospital near Palermo, I encountered a young soldier who had reached the end of his endurance. He lay on a narrow cot beneath a sagging canvas roof, surrounded by the quiet misery of men broken by war. There were no visible wounds on his body, no blood, no bandages, no shattered bone to justify his presence there. His injury was invisible, yet unmistakable. It lived in his eyes, wide and unfocused, and in the trembling of his hands as they clutched the thin blanket pulled to his chest. He was suffering from combat exhaustion, though at the time, I did not believe such a condition deserved recognition. To me, fear had always worn a single face: weakness. I had spent my life teaching men to master it, suppress it, and if necessary, destroy it. Fear, I believed, was the enemy's greatest ally. It slowed movement, shattered discipline, and infected morale. An army that tolerated fear, I told myself, was an army already defeated. So when this young soldier confessed that he could no longer fight, that the sound of shellfire still screamed in his ears even when the guns were silent, something inside me hardened. His words did not move me to sympathy. They provoked anger. That anger did not come from cruelty alone. It was forged by years of command, by memories of men who had advanced under fire despite terror, by the countless dead who had not been granted the luxury of collapse. I had seen soldiers crawl forward with mortal wounds, dragging themselves across mud and blood because orders demanded it. I had watched men obey commands even when obedience meant certain death. In comparison, this uninjured soldier seemed to represent something intolerable, a crack in the structure I had built my life upon. When I struck him, the act was sudden, almost instinctive. It was not a calculated decision, nor was it fueled by rage in the traditional sense. It was the reflex of a man who had spent decades equating discipline with survival. In that moment, I believed I was defending the army itself, protecting it from the erosion of will. I felt no satisfaction and no immediate regret. There was only a hollow stillness, as though something essential had been displaced inside me. The sound echoed through the tent, sharper than any command I had given that day. The nurses froze. The medic stood motionless, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The young soldier recoiled, his fear momentarily replaced by shock. And then there was silence, not the silence of respect or obedience, but something colder and heavier, a silence filled with judgment. As I left the tent, I sensed the shift immediately. The air outside felt different, charged with unease. The wounded men who could still lift their heads watched me pass, their expressions unreadable. Some looked away, others stared too long. The salutes were weaker, delayed, performed out of habit rather than conviction. For the first time, I felt something I had never associated with command before: distance. Still, I refused to acknowledge it. I told myself that leadership was not about comfort or popularity. A commander's duty, I believed, was to win wars, not to soothe fears. Discipline demanded harshness. Mercy, if given too freely, became indulgence. I convinced myself that the silence trailing behind me was proof that my message had been understood. Fear, I reasoned, had been driven out through force. Yet that belief required constant reinforcement. Alone with my thoughts, the certainty I projected outward began to weaken. I replayed the scene in my mind, not with guilt, but with an unsettling awareness that something had gone wrong. The act itself had been quick, but its consequences lingered. The image of the soldier's face, pale and stricken, returned to me uninvited. I dismissed it repeatedly, telling myself that war had no room for softness. But the mind does not obey orders as easily as men do. What unsettled me most was not the act of violence, but the reaction it provoked within me. I had expected justification, perhaps even a sense of moral clarity. Instead, I felt emptiness, a void where certainty should have been. That emptiness followed me through the camp, into my quarters, and into the uneasy sleep that night. It was the first time I sensed that my creed, discipline at all costs, might be incomplete. I had always believed that fear must be conquered through force of will. What I failed to understand then was that fear cannot be beaten out of a man without breaking something else in the process. The soldier I struck had already been broken by war. My action did not strengthen him, nor did it strengthen the army. It merely revealed how little I understood the limits of human endurance. At the time, however, I lacked the humility to see this truth. I told myself that hesitation was dangerous, that reflection invited weakness. I pressed forward, clinging to the identity I had built, the relentless general, the embodiment of resolve. Acknowledging error felt like surrender, and surrender was something I had trained myself never to allow. Yet the silence remained. It followed me like a shadow, present in every interaction, every glance from my officers, every forced salute from the men. I had believed fear was a tool to be used against the enemy. Instead, I had become its source. Looking back, that moment in the hospital was not an assertion of strength, but the first visible fracture in my command. It was the point at which discipline, stripped of compassion, transformed into something harsher and more dangerous. I convinced myself I had done what was necessary, but necessity without understanding is merely habit disguised as principle. That day, I did not see myself clearly. I saw only a soldier who failed to meet my standard. It would take far more than silence to teach me that the standard itself was flawed, and that fear, when ignored or punished, does not disappear. It waits. The incident did not remain contained within the canvas walls of the hospital. In war, nothing ever does. What begins as a moment becomes a rumor, and rumor hardens into record. Whispers moved faster than orders. Soldiers spoke in low voices along dusty roads and beside cook fires. Medics repeated the story in uneasy tones. By the time it reached headquarters, the truth no longer belonged to me. Whispers had become reports. Reports had become judgment. At first, I dismissed the talk. Armies thrive on rumor, and discipline demands that a commander rise above it. I told myself that fear was working as intended, that the men would remember the lesson and steel themselves against weakness. Yet beneath that confidence, something was shifting. I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, in the way officers chose their words more carefully, in the absence of the easy loyalty I had once commanded. Respect remained, but it had grown distant, colder, edged with uncertainty. Then it happened again. In another field hospital, under another merciless sun, I encountered a second soldier broken not in body, but in spirit. His voice trembled as he spoke. His eyes betrayed exhaustion so deep it bordered on despair. Once more I saw not suffering but failure. Once more I allowed anger to override judgment. And this time my actions were witnessed by many, nurses, medics, officers, and a correspondent whose pen would carry the story far beyond Sicily. The strike itself was brief, but its impact was immediate and irreversible. The room froze, no one spoke, no one looked away. I felt something I had never felt before in my career, exposure. The authority that had once shielded me now felt thin, almost fragile. This was no longer a private lapse. It was an undeniable act, recorded not only in memory but in official testimony. By nightfall, the reports were already moving through the chain of command, statements were written, names were signed. The army that had marched under my orders with relentless momentum now paused, not for the enemy, but for me. Still, I clung to justification. I told myself I was defending discipline, preserving the fighting spirit of the force. I convinced myself that history would understand even if the present did not. But history does not excuse everything. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be defended by victory alone. General Eisenhower's response came swiftly, yet without fury. That, more than anything, unsettled me. There was no shouting, no public condemnation, no dramatic display of authority. Instead, there was calm, measured judgment. His decision was precise and final. I was relieved of command. Just like that, the army that had once been mine no longer answered to my voice. The war continued without pause. Orders were given. Operations advanced. Men marched, fought, and died under new leadership. The machinery of war did not falter in my absence. That truth struck harder than any reprimand. I had believed myself indispensable, a force without which momentum would fail. Instead, the war moved forward, indifferent to my removal. For the first time, I stood outside the current of command and felt its power flow past me. Stripped of authority, I was left with myself. No staff to command, no maps to dominate, no ranks to stiffen at my approach. Without the shield of power, I could no longer define myself by orders given or victories won. I was forced to confront the man beneath the uniform, the one I had long avoided examining. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was not the silence of peace, but of isolation. Officers who once sought my counsel now kept their distance. Soldiers still saluted, but their gestures were mechanical, emptied of connection. I had not only lost command, I had lost certainty. Eisenhower's decision was not cruel, it was surgical. He did not seek to destroy me, only to contain the damage I had caused. In doing so, he forced me into a reckoning I had avoided my entire career. For years, war had provided clarity. There was always an enemy, always an objective, always a justification. Now, stripped of those, I faced a battlefield with no map. I began to replay my actions with a clarity I had previously rejected. Not to excuse them, but to understand them. I saw how easily conviction had hardened into arrogance. How discipline, when detached from compassion, became oppression. How fear, which I believed I was eradicating, had quietly taken root within me. I had feared weakness so deeply that I could not recognize humanity when it appeared before me. The removal from command was not just a professional blow, it was an existential one. I had built my identity on command, on motion, on dominance. Without those, I felt unmoored. The war no longer needed my voice, and I no longer knew who I was without it. Yet within that loss lay the beginning of understanding. Authority had protected me from self-examination. It had allowed me to mistake obedience for loyalty and fear for respect. Without it, I was forced to see the consequences of my beliefs not in abstract terms, but in human faces. I had believed leadership meant never yielding, never softening, never doubting. But now doubt was unavoidable, and with it came a painful clarity. True command does not rest solely on force. It requires judgment tempered by empathy, strength guided by restraint. Without those, authority becomes hollow. The war continued, as wars always do, driven by forces larger than any one man. But my personal war had only just begun. It was no longer fought with tanks or orders, but with memory, responsibility, and the uncomfortable truth of my own failings. For the first time in my life, I was no longer shielded by rank. I stood alone, facing not an enemy across the field, but myself. And that, I would come to understand, was the hardest battle I had ever fought. Stripped of power, I returned to the hospitals, not as a commander issuing orders, but as a man seeking forgiveness, though I did not yet know how to ask for it. Without rank to shield me, I walked the narrow paths between cots more slowly, more quietly. The wounded no longer looked at me with fear or forced obedience. They looked at me as one broken man looks at another, without expectation, without judgment. In that space, I finally began to see them clearly. They were not cowards. That truth became undeniable. These men were survivors of experiences no human mind was ever meant to endure. They had faced relentless bombardment, watched friends die beside them, and lived for weeks or months under constant threat. Their bodies had survived, but their minds bore wounds just as deep. What I had once dismissed as weakness was, in truth, the natural consequence of prolonged terror and exhaustion. War had pushed them beyond the limits of endurance, and still they had endured. As I moved from bed to bed, listening instead of commanding, my certainty began to dissolve. Each story stripped away another layer of my old beliefs. These soldiers had not failed their duty, they had fulfilled it, at an unbearable cost. The strength I had demanded without mercy had not made them stronger. It had only delayed their breaking. In recognizing this, I was forced to confront my own blindness. The most difficult moment came when I met the soldier I had struck. I expected resentment, perhaps hatred. Instead, I found none. His eyes were calm, steady, and unguarded. There was no accusation in his silence, no plea for apology. That absence of anger was more powerful than any condemnation. It left me exposed in a way discipline never had. In that moment, I learned what battle had never taught me. Courage without compassion becomes cruelty. Discipline without empathy turns into tyranny. These were not abstract ideas. They were truths written into the lives of the men before me. War does not create character. It reveals it. It strips away illusion and exposes what lies beneath: fear, pride, mercy, or the lack of it. I saw then that my greatest failure was not the loss of command, but the belief that authority excused the absence of understanding. Leadership demands more than strength. It demands restraint, humility, and the ability to recognize humanity even in moments of fear. Without those, power becomes destructive, no matter how noble its purpose may seem. Walking out of the hospital that day, I felt lighter, though not absolved. Forgiveness is not granted quickly, and it is never earned through rank or reputation. It begins with recognition, with the courage to admit fault and the humility to learn from it. For the first time, I understood that true strength lies not in crushing fear, but in acknowledging it. I returned to war and once again led men across Europe, but I was never the same man who had marched into Sicily with unshaken certainty. My command was restored, my name reclaimed its place in headlines, and my armies advanced with the same speed and force that had once defined me. Victories followed, towns were liberated, enemy lines collapsed. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged, yet within me something essential had shifted. The fire that once burned without question now flickered with doubt. I still demanded discipline, still believed in order and resolve, but I no longer viewed them with blind faith. Each command carried weight beyond strategy. Each loss echoed longer than before. I saw the faces of my soldiers more clearly now, not as units on a map, but as men shaped by fear, endurance, and sacrifice. The lessons I had learned in disgrace followed me into every campaign, reminding me that leadership carried responsibility beyond victory. When the war finally ended, the silence that followed was louder than any artillery. Europe lay in ruins, and though the enemy had been defeated, I felt no sense of completion. For years, war had given my life structure, purpose, and identity. It had defined who I was and how I mattered. Without it, I felt unmoored. Peace demanded patience, understanding, and restraint. Qualities I had spent a lifetime suppressing. I struggled to exist without battle. Ceremonies, medals, and public praise felt hollow. Applause faded quickly, leaving behind an emptiness I could not ignore. I had been trained to fight, not to rest, to command, not to reconcile. Peace, I realized, was its own kind of battlefield, one for which I was poorly prepared. In late 1945, fate delivered its final lesson. An accident left me paralyzed, confined to a hospital bed, my body intact but my independence stripped away. I, who had once measured men by their ability to endure pain and fear, now depended on others for the simplest tasks. The irony was impossible to escape. I had become what I once condemned, still, vulnerable, powerless, lying there, unable to move. I had nothing left but time and thought. The uniform no longer mattered. Rank offered no comfort. In that stillness, memories returned with unforgiving clarity. Faces of soldiers I had commanded, words I had spoken in certainty and anger, moments where strength had been mistaken for cruelty. For the first time, I did not resist these thoughts. I let them come. In my final days, I understood a truth that had eluded me through decades of command. The greatest enemy is not found across the battlefield, but within the self. Pride, fear, and the refusal to acknowledge weakness had driven me as relentlessly as any opposing army. I had believed that control was the highest virtue, yet it was control that had blinded me to compassion. Forgiveness, true forgiveness, I came to understand, cannot be demanded or awarded by authority. It comes only through humility and self-awareness. It requires a man to face his own failures without excuse and to accept responsibility without defense. That realization did not erase the past, but it gave it meaning. War had ended for the world. Cities would rebuild. Nations would heal. History would record victories and defeats, names and dates. But my personal war did not end with the signing of peace. It ended only when I accepted my humanity, when I acknowledged that strength without compassion is incomplete, and leadership without understanding is empty. In accepting that truth, I found a quiet resolution. Not triumph, not glory, but clarity. I was not the legend history would remember, nor the tyrant my failures suggested. I was a man, flawed, driven, and finally aware. And in that awareness, I found the only victory that truly mattered.